Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, either in person or online. My name is Hadil Ali, and I'm the Director of the Diversity and Leadership in International Affairs Project here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm honored to be today's moderator for our discussion on bolstering local actors' frontline response. My program at CSIS is the hub for all diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at the center. Our mission is to amplify and center diverse voices and perspectives within the international affairs and national security space. We understand at CSIS that diversity and inclusion are powerful mechanisms to building a resilient workforce and institution. Our mission is to advance diversity and inclusion in international affairs, and that extends far beyond this building and CSIS. Today's discussion about localization in the international humanitarian assistance furthers this mission by striving to not only include but center diverse and local perspectives to enhance the impact of aid. It recognizes that including local actors in both operational decision-making and leadership is not just the right thing to do. It's critical to a meaningful sectoral transformation. I'm honored to be joined today by two esteemed panelists, where we will discuss the landscape of localization, some of the challenges, and what the international community can do and can do better to support this movement. So I'll introduce to you briefly our two panelists here, and then we'll get started with today's discussion. Joining me first is Oheniba Boateng, who's a non-resident fellow at the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. Previously, he worked at the Institute as a research associate, where he focused on humanitarian action. In his work, he investigates how social accountability affects the success of humanitarian and disaster responses. Specifically, his research probes questions of responsibility, accountability, trust, and the true exercise of power in disaster zones. He holds multiple advanced degrees, including a PhD where he focused on the impact of power imbalances on humanitarian outcomes. Welcome, Boateng. Welcome, Oheniba Boateng. It's a pleasure to have you here. Our second panelist, Emmanuel Tronc, who's a senior humanitarian advisor at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. He has worked in the humanitarian sector since 1996 and brings extensive experience in conflict settings, medical and emergency humanitarian response, and networking and dialogue with state and non-state actors. He has designed and delivered over 80 professional training programs on humanitarian negotiation and engagement practices in operational hubs and conflict-affected countries, including Yemen, Iraq, Somalia, Nigeria, Libya, and Afghanistan. He has also been a senior advisor for the François-Xavier Bainot International Foundation since 2016, focusing on conflict analysis and community development programs for several entities. He's a trained economist and holds advanced degrees in economics and political science. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us here today at CSIS. Before I get started with our first discussion, I want to make sure that we set the scene here for our audience, both online and in person. It's been almost 7 years since the Grand Bargain, a moment that led 18 donor countries and 16 humanitarian aid organizations promising to directly allocate at least 25% of their humanitarian funding to local and national responders by 2020. We've also seen multiple other pledges, Charter for Change, or most recently Pledge for Change as well, that were launched as mechanisms to build and go beyond these previous commitments. What we actually saw is that by 2020, the percentage of funding to local and national actors was 3.1%, which was the exact same as 2016. Much of the criticism, we talked about this just earlier, was about the definition of localization. And how are we approaching this idea of empowering local actors? So before we start our discussion here, I think one of the most important parts is the language that we're using and understanding what we mean by localization. And part of the challenge, as we mentioned, is this lack of understanding and lack of conceptual clarity on what we mean by localization. So I'd like to ask both of you to share with our audience here, how do you define localization in the work that you've led and your expertise? And I'll start with you, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to discuss localization. The fact is, we have to recognize there's no consensus when we think about a definition of this, I would say policy concept that is localization. And each actor involved in the humanitarian sector, at the end of the day, has his own views to explain, what localization is or should be or could be on the ground at the field level. I would perhaps give 3 categories of localization that we see coming from actors, and we have to realize that it's a concept coming from international actors per se. The first one is this notion of transferring or shifting power to local actors. This notion that local actors did not have really the power or capacities to really engage as leaders on the ground when we are talking about humanitarian crisis or humanitarian action in general. So that's the first way the main international actor apprehend this notion of localization. The second one is about this vision of decentralization. Many actors explain that they have to decentralize to be closer to the issues, closer to the challenges, closer to the suffering of the people in complex environments. So they explain that localization, at the end of the day, it's a way to decentralize offices, staffing, responsibilities. The third one is around more this notion of leadership, leadership of the local staff. Because at the end of the day, and it's probably coming from Syria crisis, where humanitarian sector realized that they were not doing the job at the end of the day. It was definitely, for the vast majority of the actions, the local staff, the local actors and NGOs, they were talking about this leadership. What I would say, 2 remarks before I hand in, is that it's a concept that is part of a dynamic to always explain the humanitarian sector wants to reform itself, which is something pretty recurrent since decades, with limited gains, I would say, and successful outcomes, but we're going to come back to it. And the last thing I would say is that this notion and concept brings lots of dubitative views from local actors, first from local authorities, that are very critical in general about what do we mean by localization. So give us the money and we're going to do the job. We don't need you guys at the end of the day. But also from local actors, and I would include local communities and beneficiaries, in the sense that they realize that the humanitarian system was not taking care about this before. And if they say localization is a priority, it means that they failed before to really engage us as a real partner. So that's preliminary reflections I wanted to make.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Oheniba?
Thank you very much. Those who are familiar with my work already know that I have a problem with this term localization. And for various reasons. First off, I think it is ahistorical. It deliberately avoids a certain history. So the 2 things in history that localization avoids is the fact that since the 1960s, at least, local or homegrown, I prefer the term homegrown organizations, they have been trying to take leadership positions in their own spaces. Okay, and the reason that they have been trying to do this is because during the colonial times, their capacities and the resources they had were deliberately undermined by the colonial system. Now, many of the international organizations we have today, whether they are non-governmental or UN-based, came to continue this process of undermining, local actors, because after independence in the 60s, that was when many of these international organizations started going into the so-called global south, right? Now, these organizations went in as competitors, not as collaborators. So they had to use almost any means at their disposal to win the competition over homegrown actors, right? There are cases where even UN organizations have deliberately undermined, homegrown organizations. But in the current discourse about globalization, this history and how international organizations have actually contributed to undermining homegrown actors has been ignored. So localization has been presented as something new, okay, which is not. It's really not new. So for me, the term I prefer to use, which I recently wrote about, is restoration. Restoration of the homegrown process that was underway, right? And how we can actually give homegrown actors the space, to build their own structures, to source their own funding, and to really determine how they want to engage, with external actors. So instead of like agenda like this coming from the international organizations, we would want to have a situation where if homegrown actors want to engage with an organization like the ICRC or Doctors Without Borders, whatever, it will be on the terms that are set by the homegrown actors and not as a result of an agenda that is imposed on them with conditions. So at the end of the day, when I think of localization, for the sake of this discussion, I'm using that term. When I think of localization, I think of it as self-determination by the homegrown actors. Okay, they do their own thing. Because they already have the capacity, they know what to do, right? They just need to control the narrative and the process, and determine how they want to engage with external actors.
Yeah, thank you. And I know this is also linked to, Emmanuel, what you've worked on as well, making sure that local actors are we're not only perceiving them as implementers of projects, but rather strategic drivers of this work. So just to pick on what you've been saying, Ohaniba, this idea of, and I know, Emmanuel, in your opening remarks, you talked about as well, shifting the power from the international actors to the local actors. And you've studied the impacts of power dynamics on humanitarian aid on the continent of Africa. What do you think are the risks if humanitarian aid, the risks to humanitarian aid if those power imbalances are not corrected, right? What is being done to actually deconstruct some of these power imbalances?
Yeah, so I think there are different ways of looking at the humanitarian system as a whole. And one of the ways to start that is to recognize that different cultures and different political systems have their own way of organizing and delivering aid within their own system. So in the Gulf regions, for instance, they have a traditional way of thinking about aid with principles that are totally different from the neutrality, impartiality, these standard principles that are promoted by the UN. The African Union, for instance, has its own humanitarian policy. And in that policy, they have about 14 principles that are based on African, experiences. I studied, the history of the African Union's, evolution as a humanitarian actor. And even in the 60s and 70s, they had their own set of principles that are totally different from the ones that are now promoted by the UN. What I'm getting at is that if we do not localize, we are suppressing indigenous ways of organizing and thinking about humanitarianism, which are adapted to the context in which they happen. Okay, and this in that sense is going to suppress the capacities that they have and the self-determination. Another risk that we can talk about is, as the system is organized, it's a system in which actors in the global south are heavily dependent when it comes to funding on external actors. But if we do not change this structure, we'll keep running into situations where sometimes the entire globe faces a pandemic, for instance. Some of these homegrown actors are going to be left on their own. We have examples from the Ebola outbreak. We have examples from COVID-19, where at critical moments, international organizations, external donor states, they pulled off their support to prioritize their own people, their own country, which is not a problem. But if countries in parts of Asia, countries in Africa, parts of Africa, had been supported to build their own capacities, they would not be caught in this difficult position where they would have to wait for external powers to give them funding, to kind of give them that sort of normative standards that they can use to organize their own humanitarian aid. So we are suppressing creativity, and we are also suppressing response, even at some of the most critical points in the humanitarian system.
Thank you. Emmanuel, I want to talk a little bit more about humanitarian access and local actors within hard-to-reach areas. What have you found to be the main challenges, but also opportunities for local humanitarian actors that are in complex settings?
They face many challenges, in the sense that when there is an issue of access for the humanitarian system in general, it means that the international key actors going to transfer responsibilities and a model instead of transfer capacities at the end. They're going to try to transfer a model of functioning. First of all, this model of functioning is very costly. If I just give you a couple of examples, just a 3 days exploratory mission from UN agencies or international NGOs in a place, in a hard-to-reach area, gonna cost probably more than a 1-year budget of a local NGO on the ground. If you look at the number of access advisors that have been created, always the local actors, they say, but why you did not use us as local advisors in terms of access, And I can demultiply the category. So there is a major issue on how local actors can absorb this model. And they face, I would say, an issue of first, before talking about trust, about legitimacy. Legitimacy vis-à-vis the aid system, because the aid system push them to run operations, respect the humanitarian principles and values that have been developed through this model, denunciate when there is violation on human rights issues, and it's one of the co-elements of the risk, transfer for local actors, because they are not only a local humanitarian actor, they are an actor that is politically present in an environment contested or under pressure by belligerents. So it's very challenging, and so they have this legitimacy issue with the aid system that is very centric. When he does not have access to a place, he organizes a bit mechanisms. I remember in Kabul, for example, there were 75 coordination meetings a week at the beginning a couple of years ago. So you imagine a local actor, local NGOs in a province of Afghanistan, you don't have internet, you don't go to Kabul, how you get access to this? It's really a reality today in Cameroon, in Mali, and in other places. They want to lead as well the aid system, the funding's arrival, and there is an issue of reputation, and they are very selective vis-à-vis the NGO. So there is all of this spectrum of legitimacy vis-à-vis the aid system. But the second thing is the legitimacy vis-à-vis the authorities, because the authorities on the ground, and we know that they participate as well to obstacles to access to suffering populations. They are extremely, I would say, manipulative on the way the local NGOs can operate, playing others against others, and criticizes the system. Because the first thing going to say authorities vis-à-vis international enterprise, humanitarian enterprise, is you spend the money, but your operational field impact is limited. And so it's better to support local actors. On the other hand, they don't want local actors to be as humanitarians per se, as witnessing or perhaps being visible about what's going on the ground, because they're not going to be summary. So I would say there is a series of legitimacy vis-à-vis the authorities. And the last one is probably vis-à-vis the beneficiaries of the communities, because we should not be naive to believe that when a local NGO starts to be a partner of an international actor, there's no interest to get money or to perhaps use this opportunity as support the community for other reasons. We have seen that in Somalia with the clans for decades and in other areas, but it's also the local NGOs face major pressure vis-à-vis this, and I would insist on the gender aspects, because when it's a woman that is leading a humanitarian local NGOs, in particular, you have to demonstrate legitimacy to lead an operations, to manage an organization, and to be able really to develop a program. So the magnitude of challenges are important, and they are linked to the system in itself, because the system in itself is partly an obstacle to this local empowerment.
And thank you. I appreciate you mentioning the gender aspect as well and how that plays in. Ohiniba, I'd like to go back to the point that you made earlier about the term localization being ahistorical and how aid and the history of aid is rooted in colonialism, right? And marginalization, as you mentioned, of many different marginalized communities, including the indigenous communities as well. Can you describe what you think can happen from the humanitarian organizations to work towards this decolonization of aid? Have you seen examples being done where that's been successful?
When it comes to this term localization, I've seen a few organizations that are, seem to be serious at this in terms of building or helping, not even building, but helping to strengthen the capacities of, homegrown organizations. Some have made commitments to increase the amount of funding, including the overhead cost to local organizations. But I think for me, these efforts, important as they are, do not really hit at the core of the issue. To me, the core of the issue is self-determination. And so if external actors want to, be part of this change that is based on self-determination, I think they should be able to then imagine, their humanitarian system and their engagement in a new light. Ultimately, I think they should be able to see a future in which they are not in the driving seat. Okay, a future where they are not in the driving seat. So, and that comes from, it starts from first redefining the basis for localization. Okay, now what I see in the field is that localization is still based on charity. Okay, that a certain part of the world has, money, they have capacity, and they want to transfer, these resources to another part of the world because they are good people. Okay, I think if we use charity as the basis for localization, that is not enough because it wouldn't lead to the kind of action that is needed to cause systemic change. I think we need to redefine the basis to be one based on justice and remedying, the colonial effects or legacies of localized the humanitarian system. So I think when we shift the discourse from charity to justice, that I would believe should lead to more concrete, action with more forceful, action. Perhaps maybe going very far to even legislate, this. Like donor countries can actually create laws to expect their organizations to behave in a certain way to put this justice agenda forward. Okay, so these international organizations really need to think differently about the humanitarian system before they can decolonize. Another thing I think is that maybe one of the easiest to do is that each of these organizations should actually write their own history, especially the process through which they extended their operations from maybe Europe or North America to the rest of the world. Okay, and chances are that they are going to find in their history how this process, in the process of establishing themselves in other parts of the world, they had to displace homegrown organizations to be able to establish themselves there. I have written about the fact that many international organizations, non-governmental, governmental, even UN organizations, I've written that almost all of them have what I call erosion footprint. Okay, the number of local organizations that they had to compete with, that they had to displace, in order for them to have the spaces that they have, in Africa or Asia or wherever they are operating today. So, to sum it up, it starts from thinking differently about the system. Yes.
I'm going to ask a difficult question.
Yes.
Do you think international organizations are actually interested in moving from charity to justice? This goes back to Emmanuel's point earlier about there's constant talks and pledges for reform, right, but limited gain. Is there an actual interest and incentive for them to do this?
I don't think they are interested. No. Yeah.
Perhaps I can answer.
Okay, maybe it's you, but I
No, I would not say that. I think there are many individual initiatives, and it's from CARE, from NRC, from many organizations, even from the UN, that have the habit to work with local actors, because vast majority of the UN agencies program are run by local staff and local organizations. The fundamental problem is that it's not harmonized, as there is no vision per se, and we have to contextualize when we say that, but we have made some observation at HHI that for the vast majority of the design of the project, they don't take enough in considerations local priorities or local visions. I'll just give you an example. In Ukraine, just during the past years, before last year and the new invasion of the Russian authorities, there were a conflict already ongoing there, and there was some deployment of international actors. Sometimes international actors privilege, the distribution of solar panels in areas instead of providing things related to education, and instead of priorities defined by local actors. You see what I mean? So the problem is that the way the international actors see the priorities, with limited evaluation, limited field assessments when they don't have access, is something in a decalage with the expectation of the aspiration of the local actors. That's the first thing. And the second thing, I would say that local actors do not see their future as strictly a humanitarian role, because let's be honest, there is a major fatigue of humanitarian enterprise worldwide speaking. People are exhausted about actors coming from decades explaining how they're going to change a bit the situation, and at the end of the day, there's still the same sufferings. We repeat and we organize incredible meetings worldwide speaking. So they want to inscribe themselves in a dimension more social, more integrative about all the challenges as a community on the ground, and also how they challenge their own authorities. And again, I come back to it because it's central. The international system is too accommodating with authorities in general. When a humanitarian coordinator plays golf with the Ministry of Interior, do you think he's going to challenge the access issue in a context? No way. The reality is that the international system is extremely resilient to engage with perpetrators or actors that are extremely in responsibility vis-à-vis the suffering of people. And for the local actors, it's difficult to apprehend that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I also would say that I don't think, with the kind of future that I would want to see, like even as of now, there's no end point in localization. Like, how would localization look like when it's complete? Okay, there's no end point in that, which is why I'm saying that I don't think international, organizations are really interested in shifting, or at least pulling back for the spaces they have to be inhabited by homegrown actors. I think that the fact that many local organizations are run by local staff of international organizations does not necessarily mean that there is localization, because at the end of the day, they are still operating by the logics of whichever international organization they are working for. Okay, and these organizations sometimes see themselves as competitors to the government and to local organizations. I'll give you just one example. Just last year, the African Union is still reforming many of its institutions, and one of the new agencies that it is still empowering is the African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So last year, the General Assembly of the African Union, which is the heads of states and government, the president, whoever, they voted to give the African CDC the mandate to be able to declare a pandemic within Africa, as a threat to health, on the African continent. The World Health Organization was really upset with this, that the African Union is giving its own, organization this mandate to have this control within its own spaces. And the argument was that the mandate, if exercised, is going to, undermine the global health governance. this is an argument that makes sense, at the conceptual level. But when you think of the fact that this is an African, institution trying to solve its own problem within its own spaces, to me, it's really weird to use a term like this to say that they can't do that because they are going to undermine, a global system. And that is because international organizations always want to see themselves in the picture, which is not a bad thing if they are doing, things that help people in the end. But at the end of the day, if those communities or countries or international, organizations within Africa or within whichever continent that are affected by the problem decide to solve the problem in a certain way, in a way that is suitable to their own conditions, I think the most reasonable way to proceed is to ask how you can, help the process rather than to, disrupt the, this sort of homegrown process that is being implemented. It's one of the many reasons I have, which I say that, international actors may not really be ready to shift from charity to justice.
Absolutely. Emmanuel, I know you talked a little bit about this, but would love if you can delve deeper and share with us some case studies on how the humanitarian aid system as a whole contributes or hinders support to local humanitarian approaches. What are some of these driving factors that are either supporting or hindering those approaches?
I think the first support I have in mind is that the employment rate, because if you look at a humanitarian environment today, there is a large contribution of local people as human resources in organization. So usually the ratio, and I just talking about how it was before. We were saying, I remember when I started with MSF in the 90s, about 3 international staff or 30 local staff at the end of the day. So I think there is definitely an importance of employment opportunities. There are representation in platforms. Now they have created in different contexts, like in Cameroon and other contexts, kind of local NGO platforms. It's interesting because it's full of a large variety of local NGOs, justice, human rights, development, peace building, humanitarians. And what was interesting in our observations is that local NGOs that are on the ground in the outreach areas do not feel represented by this local actor, but it's local representation. But it's something that exists, so they support. They provide training and mentoring, on which we can say, and it has been said a bit yesterday, the training is very opportunistic. It's not something built as a strategy to really create this capacity to design and to lead operations. It's more something that, okay, our donor has given us some money, so we have the time to do this training, and they try to discuss humanitarian access and negotiation, etc. But it exists training. Direct access to funding as well, because the main issue is the money at the end of the day and how local actors can get access, directly speaking, to the donors. Some NGOs do the exercise. I think they try, at least in some context, like NRC, for example, and others. CARE is very strong as well to even substitute its international presence for local actors. But we have to say, it remains very limited. The donors are extremely shy, I would say, to engage directly with local actors. They talk a lot about accountability, but they also do not want to say that they are engaged on political support to authorities. When a state is engaged, military speaking, in a context of conflict, how it's difficult for them to support directly local NGOs that are trying to exist in a particular environment. You see what I mean? So, but it exists. So this support in terms of access to funding. So we have to say that. At the reverse, again, it's true that the way the system is organized continue to create a cascade approach, and a kind of leash on many aspects for local actors to exist. I have to say some topics and some thematics that are central are totally abandoned in conflict settings today. Education, human rights protection aspects. We talk a lot about cash distribution and dropping of aid, but we know that this type of activities cannot represent the core of the humanitarian responses on the ground, because if it's the case, why do we need international actors to take such amount of money to do cash distribution? Honestly, we don't need them. So we should think about it seriously, but it's very sad because local actors want to contribute to the safety and protection of the communities where they intervene and want to discuss sensitive issues. The fact is, local actors and local humanitarian actors have difficulties to discuss sensitive issues with a key partner, international UN agencies or international NGOs, because they are afraid to be criticized or to not to receive the money aspect. So the money, I think the funding is too central in the decision making and in the opportunity to co-design, and there is no co-design of programs. It's more something that is really ad hoc and at occasional, so I think it's regrettable. And the last thing I would come back to with regards to advocacy and public communication. You know, we are talking about today conflict realities where humanitarians are very, very prudent to criticize the belligerents or to at least denunciate situations that are supposed to be red lines or unacceptable. And I think, again, Syria has created a new norm on the way the authorities manage and deal with international actors, because they have realized how far they can go with a kind of a tacit consent from the humanitarians, because limited denunciation of what do you do, which type of programs, which type of people you access, etc. And I have to say that there is too much accommodations to the authorities functioning, and it's not providing a support to local actors at the end of the day.
I'm going to ask you one more question before we turn it over to our audience. If you'd like to ask a question, feel free to use the QR code, and I'll be able to take questions from both our in-person and online audience. I'd like to shift gears to talk about this idea of burden of proof for local actors. Local actors are often seen as best suited for the work because of their networks, because of also a nuanced understanding of the social, cultural, political, or religious landscape. However, we see that the burden of proof for local actors to demonstrate their neutrality or independence is much, much higher compared to international actors. So, two-part question here. What can local actors do to ensure that their humanitarian action is perceived as impartial? And where is the responsibility of the international community to ensure that they're mitigating this double standards as much as possible? And Oheniba, we'll start with you for this one.
Okay, the local actors that I'm familiar with, they tend to be more pragmatic. Okay, they do what is needed in whichever situation they find themselves in. Okay, you realize that at the end of the day, these principles do not matter much. You know, sometimes even for the ICRC and other organizations that are like the apostles of these principles, sometimes when they find themselves in a certain situation, they are forced to compromise. You know, like Emmanuel was just saying, that there's a lot of accommodation towards politics. Okay. So I think it's, for me, I find it uncomfortable insisting that humanitarian local actors need to be seen in a certain way before they are counted as valid or responsible. I think we should rather look at, you know, what they are doing on the ground and how they are adapting to situations, because these organizations, chances are that they've been in their localities for a very long time. They know the local governments, perhaps even the national governments. They know the people, they know the terrain very well, and they can be trusted to navigate this terrain. Okay, but if you insist that they should be partial, if you insist that they should be independent, if you insist that they should play by certain principles, chances are that you are going to force them to cut certain relationships that are really essential for their work. Okay, so I think we should rather trust, you know, local organizations for the pragmatism that they demonstrate, and then see how we can support them. So from the side of the international, you know, organizations, I think they should rather be looking at the kind of innovations that are coming from these, you know, local organizations, and then see where they can plug in the missing pieces when they are invited to do so.
Yeah, I think first of all we should break a myth with regards humanitarian principles and international actors. I think the vast majority of the international humanitarian actors do not fulfill the full functioning, at least, but are not in capacity or willingness to fulfill humanitarian principles ambition, and for various reasons. And again, as the system has been built under the umbrella or through a model that is developed by the UN system, I think it's not surprising, considering the political heart of the UN aid system. That's the first thing. So I don't believe that the local NGOs are less compliant with humanitarian principles than international one. It's a criticism that is made to close the door to transferring a bit leadership and capacities on the ground, but I don't think it's true. And I think they understand the importance of first the impartiality, because let's be honest, I think the only principles that is operational and in your own hands decision, it's impartiality. Neutrality, and it's really a perception aspect, and independence, you have a willingness to be independent, but who is really independent, on the ground today? It's full of interdependencies. So the principle, it's something we should manipulate cautiously. What is clear is that with local NGOs empowerment, we have new opportunities to evaluate the impact humanitarians have on the ground, which honestly have not been done for years, consciously and honestly by the humanitarian actors. It's easy to say the blockages or the dysfunctioning is due to external factors, logistic insecurities, conflict, belligerence. But honestly, it's important to look at how we can be impactful and how we are not impactful. And I think the local actors that collect data and information a lot for international actors are a very good vehicle to understand how the humanitarian actions can be redeveloped through a more simple and impactful stuff. The main issue is, can we still do operations with a limited cost? Again, because we arrive to a situation where the aid system is so costly that I don't believe it can be transferred to local actors. And I come back to Ukraine, where the Ukrainian mobilization have been incredible and is something very traditional, in Ukraine. But when you see the means and the capacity of local NGOs and the way the international enterprise have been deployed since a year, there is a parallel system with hierarchy of local NGOs now that have been attracted just for money aspect, and we create a kind of international humanitarian governance dependency, which is extremely dangerous. Again, we have to break this spectrum of dependency where we have put not only the beneficiaries and the communities, but as well the local NGOs potentially. So that's where it's critical, I think, to think about through different contexts on how to redefine this.
Thank you both. I'll turn it over to our in-person audience if there are any questions. I'll just take a first question I have here. And this question is for you, Ohaniba. You talked about using the word restoration instead of the terminology localization. And we see there are many terms that are used in the humanitarian aid sector, the language that we're using, that we need to look back and think about that language that we're using. Things like capacity building, right? Or going to the field, or going on mission, right? A lot of this language
jargon.
The jargon, that's right.
Participation.
Absolutely. And all this language perpetuates this perception that the global south is uncivilized, or even the word aid alludes to an imbalance of power dynamics. How do you perceive language as a tool of localization?
Yeah, when we talk of language, we need to realize that it's a form of power, because it contains not just the sounds, but also the knowledge that is used to create organizations and run them. Okay, so principles like impartiality, independence, all these principles are just languages that have been translated into action or to create certain organizations, which is why I said that for like decolonization to really occur, we even need to start thinking and talking about the humanitarian system differently. Okay, in the 60s, for instance, when the African Union, or at the time the Organization of African Unity, when they started, they created a 10-year plan, which they wanted to use as the blueprint to eliminate the refugee problem from Africa within like a period of 10 years. As to whether that was possible or not is another issue, but it's an example of an actor thinking about humanitarianism differently, okay? And that is through language, what we see and how we describe it and how we describe what we want to do, okay? So I think it's important that we should be able to envision a world where we can use different concepts, where we can use different words, words that will create a different meaning of the reality we see and what we want to do. Like the principles that I'm talking about, the ones promoted by the UN are totally different from the ones promoted by the countries in the Gulf region. The 14 principles that the African Union has, of course, it includes the 4 or 5 UN principles, but it has additional 9 principles that are created by the African Union themselves based on their realities. Okay, so actually the UN narrative is just the most dominant of multiple narratives that are going on. So we really need to be able to think outside of the UN narrative to see what other humanitarian cultures are doing and the way they are describing their own situations, and see if we can actually, the international community can, what they can do to contribute to what the different cultures are seeing in their own realities.
Emmanuel, did you want to add anything on the language piece?
Yeah, what is clear is that for the vast majority of local actors, local NGOs, they don't understand this jargon, because it's something difficult to apprehend. Even for the international actors, it's something that is evolving very quickly. And it's true, the system as turning in itself, particularly when they have limited access, they create discussions for the discussions, and policy papers. I remember per clusters, they try to reshape a bit visionary papers per cluster thematic every year, and it takes months and months to organize it. So, and they ask local NGOs participations, but and this it's not very clear. Again, we need simplification, but trust in the functioning of the language, and again, associated to real field assessments and honest assessments about a situation. Can we say in very simple words about what's going on the ground today? I think it's more and more difficult because it's really blurred and complexified and theoretical.
Absolutely. We have another question from Kumba, who's a local NGO representative in Mali, and they're saying that Mali's heavy dependence on foreign assistance has created a complex and multifaceted governance dynamic in the country. How can INGOs promote and support national ownership and abide by the imperative of do no harm?
Well, do you want to take that?
You first.
Okay, all right. So I think in conflict situations, it's difficult. I think that sometimes we just have to accept that there are limitations to what international organizations, even local organizations, can do. Okay, which is why, and this a lot of people might not agree with me, but I find it problematic that the localization as currently constituted sometimes, almost all the time, tries to go around the national government to engage with community-based organizations directly. But I think in some cases that might work. In most cases it wouldn't work, because whether we like it or not, at the end of the day, these local organizations operate in a certain political system, and they can be affected by the decisions of the government, the laws of the government. So in conflict situations, instead of trying to engage community-based organizations directly, I think it will help if the government, however illegitimate that we might consider that to be, that government to be at that point in time, I think we can use negotiations to help to let them open humanitarian corridors for aid to go through.
Yeah, thank you, Emmanuel.
For Mali in particular, I would add that it's the time for a bet of trust for local actors, because since 2012 in particular, there have been a massive deployment of international presence in all spectrum of the state authorities and the functioning of it, the governance, security governance, reform, development, etc., etc. It did not really succeed. At the end of the day, we can say it's a catastrophe in terms of access to civilians, access to areas, and limited negotiations with the militaries and with non-state armed groups on the ground. So I would definitely transfer not responsibility and not a particular model, but at least capacity, and giving the capacity for local actors to try to do on a different way, even if it's perhaps less sophisticated as international actors can provide programs, something that is more tangible on the ground, in the different provinces, or at least accessible provinces. So it would be, I would say, my humble recommendations, because if we continue to believe that we can stay in Bamako and develop programs in the center of Mali without visiting there, without really an understanding about what's going on, I think we're going to replicate the same mistakes and the absence of lessons learned.
Yeah, absolutely. We have one more question about funding, and I know we talked about that a little bit here today. This person asking this question is saying that local NGOs struggle to secure funding due to administrative requirements, and we've talked about this, of international donors, or just difficulty to navigate the bureaucracy. How can international donors make the process easier on the end for local NGOs or local actors in general to be able to secure and access funding?
I think for international organizations, they need to realize that sometimes they have their own conditionalities before these local organizations can access the funding they have. I think they need to trust these organizations more, because they know what they are doing, they know the realities they face on the ground. The process of trying to make funding conditional, that they apply certain principles or they work with some other international organizations who is like going to, mentor them or handhold the entire process. I think it's disrespectful really to local organizations. So I think for me it is a matter of trust, and also removing the middlemen. Removing the middlemen between the local organizations and the donor. Between these two, actors, the local organizations and the donor, we perhaps have 2 or 3 steps before they can get direct access to, donors. We have perhaps the donors' own organizations. We have, an organization that has been contracted by the donors' organization, and then we have several experts and consultants. I think there are too many processes involved. So reducing the steps between the local organization and the donor, I think, will help to ensure that there is, a very high level of communication and, collective action between the donor and the local organization.
Yeah, I will be perhaps more provocative and say that from my point of view, it's unacceptable that today you have still key donors that do not provide support to local NGOs. Like just take the example of ECHO, for example, that continue to say that they want to focus on international actors. That's the first thing. The second thing is I believe that we should try to see at least 40 to 50% of the fundings going on the grounds to local actors. It should be a prerequisite. It should be accompanied by international actors that have all the means in terms of human resources and technicity and the expertise to support this. It should be mandatory to a program. When you realize that, for example, UK only support in Cameroon ICRC and WFP for various reasons, political reasons. You say we have a serious issue here, and it's not to criticize UK per se, but it's the same for the vast majority of the donors. I would say as well that the donors, we should create at least reforms to detach a bit the funding that are associated to political strategies and political development. If you look at the way the French diplomacy and the AfD organize its support to local actors on the ground, you see how politically as well it's oriented. So it should be detached. But that's the urgency today, and how can we accept that after 7 years of a grand bargain discussion in Istanbul, we arrive to the 3%? How we feel confident vis-à-vis local people, even vis-à-vis local authorities. How do they love to us at the end of the day, and what do you think they say to their local counterparts? They say, you see these guys, do you think they respect you? No. So do we want to continue to cultivate this approach, or do we want really to break a bit this dynamic? And I would say it's the urgency.
Yeah. I'm going to combine a last question that I had and one that came in from the audience here before we wrap up our discussion. We talked a lot, we've been very critical about this idea of localization. What advice would you have to donors who have committed to themselves, for the sake of this discussion, to this idea of localization, and how do we hold them accountable? Because ultimately, accountability is one of the major challenges here. So what advice would you have? And Oheniba, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll go back to donors thinking about their entire engagement differently, and also they could go as far as when they shift to justice, they should go as far as even legislating this, making it mandatory by law for their funding, or at least a certain percentage of their funding, to make it, directly to local organizations. But broadly, I think we really need an endpoint in localization. Or how is it going to look like when it's done? Is it going to be here 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years? Let's say 100 years. How is it going to look like when it's done? Okay. As of now, it's really vague. It is just an idea that everyone is picking and choosing which side suits them. But I think we need a more concrete definition, and then a timeline. Even if we are not going to make that timeline, at least it gives us something to work towards. Okay. But shifting from charity to justice really is very important, and backing that with legislation, I think that is really the way to go.
Absolutely. Emmanuel, what advice would you have to donors, and how do we hold them accountable?
Very complex. Yeah, it's very complex. But listening to you, I'm always surprised how the humanitarian actors have handed to support human rights per se in the activities. And I remember when I have started with MSF. Just after Rwanda genocide, I think we were always saying that we cannot expect to have better field conditions than the people affected on the ground. And if we believe we can be outside these realities, that's where the problems start for us in terms of legitimacy and understanding about what's going on. The problem today is that we have abandoned a bit this human rights ambition, and that blocks as well opportunity. Going to justice, it's already a step very far in context where we are in incapacity to really even use the violations fines to really put under pressure some specific actors. So, but definitely coming back to the human rights as a dimension, as a core reflection about the way it's organized. I think donors they have to take risks, and donors have securing a bit the actions. I remember they were always explaining we want to reduce the number of partners, for example. And honestly, if you reduce the number of partners, you have to increase the number of local partners. That's for sure. Because honestly, it's not a criticism, but supporting MSF or supporting the ICRC, what is really the risk you take? Come on, let's be honest, you don't take much risk. But supporting, Reach Out in Cameroon, or a local NGO, or Poliska in Ukraine, there you take serious risks. There you take a serious bet. And to accompany them, again, accompany not as a patronizing stuff or a mentoring stuff or something very Occidental, but accept for them to do mistakes, as the international system's doing mistakes on a daily basis. But, it's like we are very good to forget our own mistakes, but very hard with local actors. So value of a type of visions about local approaches, with the communities, with elders, integrating something more. I don't like this nexus agenda per se, but I see a relevance, to engage on various fronts. Again, local actors are not there to exist only in emergency settings. They're gonna stay. They are the present and they are the future. The humanitarian actors, sorry, it's not the future of it today.
Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you for being here with us at CSIS. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise. I thoroughly enjoyed such a thought-provoking discussion. Thank you all for joining us, either online or in person. I'd like to thank my colleagues Rafi, Naz, and Dwayne for supporting and making this conversation happen. I'd like to also thank Jude Larnard for their leadership in orchestrating such an incredible conference for the last couple of days. If you are able to, I would encourage you to join us for our next conversation on the impact of sanctions on humanitarian and peacekeeping operations. Thank you so much for joining us today.